content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, sensitive topics, and explicit language that may be triggering, offensive, or sensitive subjects to some viewers and listeners. Discretion is advised. The purpose of this podcast is to explore and discuss true crime cases for entertainment and educational purposes only. This podcast does not intend to glorify or sensationalize crime, but rather aims to analyze and understand the complexities of human behavior in the criminal justice system. We encourage listeners to approach this content with empathy, critical thinking, respect for the victims and their families.
Tonight, we're opening the history books and looking into the life of one of the most notorious figures in American organized crime history, the one and the only Queen of Thieves, Mrs. Fredricka Mandelbaum, also known as Marm Mandelbaum. While the New York in the late 1880s was a buzzing and ambitious opportunity, Mrs. Mandelbaum was building her empire right in heart of Manhattan, but hers was an empire of crime, corruption, and cunning skills. It's time to start the show. Let's hit it. Hi, I'm Winnie Schrader. Welcome to another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. One of the things I've always been fascinated with true crime is organized crime, the mafia. I'm a huge Sopranos fan. I watched all the old Cagney movies, Robert De Niro, Casino, Goodfellas, you name it. But when you look at the name organized crime, it should have triggered our minds to think, who started the organized crime? Who was the architect? Well, it wasn't a man. It was a woman. Of course it was. That's why it's organized crime. But I came across this book. It's called The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum, Margalit Fox, who is she's considered a literary stylist in American journalism. After a 24-year career, she retired in 2018 from the New York Times. And she's given the front page award from the Newswomen Club in 2011. So she's very prolific with her writing and her research. And I wanted to get this book. So I want you guys to grab your favorite glass of wine and we're going to settle in because we're going to have a lot of fun with Margalit and we are going to learn about the birth of organized crime. Welcome to the show, Margalit.
Thank you, Winnie. Great to be here.
Yeah. So, I saw this book and I'm like, wait a minute. Somebody who started the organized crime was a woman? How did she get from coming here to America to becoming the mother of the mafia in a man's world? I mean, back then, it was a male-dominated world. So why don't you give us a little backstory on her, on Fredricka, and kind of I would like to learn with my listeners how she came about being where she was in the crime world, I guess you would say.
It's a great question, and the answer reveals a pretty cool story. I do want to explain, we are very careful in the book not to attribute her as being the first organized crime boss. It's always dangerous when you're writing history, journalism, historical nonfiction to ascribe being the first or the last to do something to anybody, because the minute you do that, somebody comes out of the woodwork that's done it 5 seconds before or 5 seconds after. So we are very careful to say that Fredricka Mandelbaum, who came here in steerage in 1850 with little more than the clothes on her back from what is now central Germany, and lived in dire poverty on the Lower East Side, started life as a street peddler in New York. We are very careful to say that she was the first great organized crime boss, or the first major organized crime boss. There was certainly organized crime that was just starting to gel in major American cities around that time. And of course, she had nothing to do with the mafia. That was strictly an Italian operation, as we know. It started in Italy centuries before, and then took root in America with the first big wave of Italian immigration in the 1880s and 1890s. As I'm sure many of your listeners know, what is considered the first recorded mafia murder in the United States took place in the 1890s in New Orleans, when a man named Vincenzo Otumvo had his throat cut in a card game. I guess he was holding the wrong cards. But what's so interesting about Fredricka Mandelbaum is when we think of a mob boss, we either think Tony Soprano, or we think a big strapping guy with spats and pinstripes and a Tommy gun during Prohibition. In either case, heavy emphasis on the word guy. Needless to say, Mrs. Mandelbaum, a nice, zoftig Jewish mother of four, was none of those things. And what is so fascinating is that she literally built from nothing a criminal syndicate that she ruled over for 25 years, largely in the open, and didn't spend so much as a day in jail. And we can get into the reasons why that was. She built it from nothing. She specialized in receiving stolen goods. She was a fence. She built an empire in which something like $10 million worth of stolen goods passed through her little haberdashery shop on the Lower East Side that was the front for her business. That's $10 million in 19th century money. It's like 300 million today. By the time she died in 1894, she had a personal fortune estimated to be as much as $1 million, 20 million today. This was someone who came here with nothing. And so she was inarguably the first crime boss with real longevity, who basically turned the scattershot, not especially remunerative business of stolen property crime into a well-oiled underworld capitalist enterprise.
Yeah, then that's what the question that just popped in my mind is, how did she build such an extensive network of criminals and become so prominent? And, what she did obviously worked. It's like, people throw things out there, see what sticks. Well, she obviously knew what she was doing, or she just had the skills to make this work. So what set her apart from some of the other organized crime groups at the time in New York? And she was, you just said she was able to move millions of dollars of goods and stuff through her shop. Like, what set her apart from the other groups and organized crime groups in the area?
Well, one of the really fascinating things about America and American cities in this period, the second half of the 19th century, is in the so-called upper world, the realm of legitimate enterprise. For the first time, American professionalism was really taking hold, and professions like law and medicine were starting to implement rigorous standards for membership, for education, certification, professional conduct, where before there had been few to none. And one of the reasons to do that is to, as in medicine, to keep out the quacks and the hawkers of patent medicine. Oops, sorry, I just knocked something over. Let me retake that. One of the reasons to do that in medicine, for instance, is to drive out the snake oil salesmen, the people who were hawking patent medicine, and hangout shingles saying, we're the real doctors, we're the professionals. It's a way to control your market. Strikingly, at the same time, the same sort of professionalism was happening in the underworld. Crime, of course, has existed since the dawn of humankind. But in American cities at that time, crime was of the sort of Herbert Asbury gangs of New York variety. It was mostly these waterfront street toughs that were pretty much invested in beating people up. They would steal stuff, but their brand of crime was literally disorganized. It was ad hoc. It was opportunistic. It wasn't especially lucrative. They might see a woman coming out of a store with a bundle and they'd knock her down and take it, but there wasn't any planning. And what Fredricka did, although of course she'd never been to university, much less business school, but she somehow understood that this had to be consolidated and run as a business. And she turned out to be brilliant in putting her finger to the wind and doping out what it was that Americans, particularly this newly emerging middle class that was arising then in American cities, figuring out what it was they wanted to buy, but not pay full price for, or even full wholesale price for. What you had in America at that time, along with the rise of professionalism, was this inundation of consumer goods, thanks to mass production. And so there were these new middle-class men and women with a bit of disposable income set aflame by advertisements in newspapers and magazines and the domestic advice manuals aimed at women. They were under great pressure to keep up with the Joneses by filling their houses with all of the new stuff that American material culture had to offer. Fancy furniture, curtains, lamps, rugs, every kind of knickknack and tchotchke. Well, even a middle-class family couldn't afford all that swag, but as these new bourgeois men and women quickly discovered, they could solve the problem neatly through clandestine visits to their friendly neighborhood fence. So Fredricka Mandelbaum's genius was to fill the void, that the gap in the market that she had spied at the nexus of thrift, stuff, class, and desire. So that, starting in the late 1850s, is what she began to do.
Oh, God. So that kind of like gives that where she's getting all these goods that people want, but obviously they couldn't afford. So it's kind of like it fell off the truck type of thing. That is genius. And you would think back when people think of mobs, like the stuff that they buy and sell, with the drugs, weapons, things like that. But a lot, back then they had to use with what they had. So what was something popular that everybody wanted was, people didn't even have soap. Poor people didn't even have soap back then. So it's like those kinds of things. Yeah, that she knew what the need was and created a business around it. That is genius.
Right. And it's very important to emphasize, and this was something that gave me permission to tell her story. Her brand of organized crime, unlike the guys 70 years later in Prohibition, her brand of organized crime was almost entirely nonviolent. She was literally interested only in what she might have euphemistically called redistribution of property. And she robbed from the rich and gave, or rather sold at deep discount to this new middle class. So from her point of view, everybody benefited. She wasn't having people whacked. She wasn't having people's kneecaps broken. That came only later when the boys muscled in because, they now saw how lucrative organized crime should be. And she was one of the people who helped make that happen. Fredricka started out living in desperate poverty on the streets of the Lower East Side, tenement poverty, squalor, streets filled with garbage, no running water, no sanitation, communal backyards overflowing with sewage from the outhouses that everyone in the building used. And in fact, she and her husband came in 1850 with their infant daughter. The infant daughter died because diseases like typhoid, cholera, consumption were just running through the tenements like wildfires. It's easy to imagine. I can't impute thought to her. She was smart. She left no personal papers. She knew better than to put anything in writing in her line of work. But it's easy enough to imagine that after she lost her infant child, she resolved, my family is never going to live in poverty again. So she started out, like her husband, as a street peddler on the Lower East Side. Fredricka sold lace door to door, but she was so smart, she would have seen very quickly that street peddling is, as one modern historian calls it, the bottom level of business activity. It's basically a way to stay poor forever because there are so many street peddlers, men, women, children, thronging the streets of Lower Manhattan. We've all seen those 19th century photographs. That was real stuff. So the odds on any one of them being able to make enough to keep body and soul together were overwhelming. So we know that sometime in the late 1850s, she'd been here less than a decade, she apprenticed to two older Jewish men who were noted criminal fences in their day, a man called General Abe Greenthal and another man called Mose Erich. And from them, she learned the value of some of the most prized artifacts of mid-19th century culture that passed rather fleetingly through their hands. Lace, silk, sealskin, a whole bunch of fine fabrics. So she began, from her peddler setup, quietly reselling goods that were brought to her by neighborhood shoplifters and petty thieves. She asked no questions about provenance, and she turned around and resold the swag at a profit. She was so good at this that by the end of the decade, around 1859, she had amassed enough capital to quit peddling altogether and strike out on her own as a solo entrepreneur with a growing and higher class cadre of shoplifters and thieves working for her. So that is when Mrs. Mandelbaum became a professional fence.
That's amazing. That is so cool and such a rich part of our history that I don't think many people know about. Like, I have never heard of her before, and to know how innovative she was and to take her circumstances and to make it the best she could with what she had to work with. I mean, that's brilliant in my mind.
That's right.
No, so she had her little her minions going out and shoplifting. So were they shoplifting from, like, were they getting these goods and stuff from the ship, like the shipping containers and stuff coming right off the boat? Or were they going around into people's homes or other shops around in the area, taking these items and bringing them to them?
Pretty much all of those things, because by this point in history, New York was the country's premier center for manufacturing and commerce. The ports were bustling with all sorts of good stuff coming in. But she basically, as she rose in wealth and power, the swag she had her thieves go after got better and better. So she started out just with local petty thieves and pickpockets. She then moves on to employing this coterie of female shoplifters that are already starting to circulate in these new, beautiful, alluring, mercantile pleasure palaces that would soon be called department stores. And of course, what she could offer these women was steady employment, the promise of bail if they were ever arrested, legal representation from her breathtakingly, deliciously crooked lawyers, the New York firm of Howe and Hummel that basically represented the New York underworld and whom she valued so much, she kept on $5,000 a year retainer. That's like $100,000 today. She would wine and dine her thieves at the groaning table in her opulent private apartments above the modest haberdashery shop on the corner of Clinton and Rivington Streets on the Lower East Side. So there was real pleasure and security and solidarity in being part of the Mandelbaum organization. And not for nothing was she called Mother or Ma or Marm Mandelbaum, because she had this very motherly attitude toward her employees. My chicks, she would call them. And my favorite thing, because looking at it with 21st century eyes, it's quaint and charming. In addition to all of these other things she would provide for employees, she would provide getaway horses and carriages whenever they had to flee the scene of a crime. So she treated them very well. Of course, there was the iron fist inside that velvet glove, but a lot of criminals really adored her and wanted to work for her. So she pretty quickly became one of the biggest things in town. And in fact, her network of thieves and resale agents extended across the country.
That's awesome. Yeah, it sounds like she was like, yeah, the top employer of the town. Because yeah, it seems like she took care of her employees, and yeah, she probably had that maternal instinct, like, these are my children, I gotta take care of them. And she, and honestly, knowing, being a mother myself, she was probably saving a lot of these people from living in dire circumstances as well, and getting them into a safer place to live, especially if they had children. I have a feeling that she was very maternal with any children that her criminals had, that made sure the children were taken care of, because she lost her own child in squalor. So what was, you said that she kind of alluded getting arrested at the time. What was kind of her relationship with the local law enforcement, and how did she managed to evade the law? And then after the break, when we're going to take a quick break here, coming up in a little bit, we'll talk about her downfall after that break. But coming up to when she's doing all of her stuff, she's growing. How did she evade? And did she have like the police in her back? I mean, was she paying them off to keep them away from her business and have them look away and just let her do what she needed to do?
Well, without giving too much away, I think I can safely say that Fredricka Mandelbaum took the injunction, "The policeman is your friend," to logical and necessary and, let's say, lucrative extremes. And remember, this is a period that historians now call the Flash Age. New York was a city on the make, and absolutely everyone, whether it was these upper world captains of industry, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Astors, who, let's face it, made their quote unquote legitimate uptown fortunes through a variety of tactics, including bribery, perjury, intimidation, breaking up strikes, often with fatal consequences, cornering markets, making hostile takeovers, yet that was considered above the law. Well, the people in the underworld were doing exactly the same thing. That was considered illegal. But there was a very free and easy flow of ideas, money, shared goals between the upper world and the underworld in the New York of that time. And so Fredricka would give these fabulous dinner parties in her apartments that were decorated like the Palace of Versailles, on the Lower East Side, but crystal chandeliers, plush draperies, mahogany chairs, the finest crystal, staff of servants. Down one side of this long table would be the creme de la creme of criminality, the country's foremost housebreakers and bank burglars and jewel thieves, all in evening dress, whining and dining and laughing. And down the other side of the table, also in evening dress, whining and dining and laughing, along with the criminals, were some of the top city officials of Tammany Hall, including aldermen, judges, and police officials. So let's just say it was all very cozy, and that stood her in good stead for 25 years.
Well, no, and at that time, honestly, I'm looking back at a lot of the historical events of that era. It almost seemed like some of the cops were kind of encouraging people like her, because they were kind of honing in some of the criminals, like taking some of these people that are just attacking people and just like, whacking people upside the head and taking their money. And, it was kind of, I wonder if it was kind of eliminating all that and kind of, even though, because there know there's going to be crime when you have, at that time, when you have that many cultures going into just a small area in New York City, you're going to have problems, and you're going to have people, you had your Irish gangs, like you said, your Italian gangs, your Jewish gangs and stuff. But it almost seems like, looking at the law enforcement, do you feel like law enforcement at the time kind of encouraged people like her kind of getting these kind of feral criminals and kind of making them a little bit more professional breaking the law?
Well, I can't impute intent. I don't know what people 150 years ago were thinking, but we certainly know from the evidence of their appearance at her dinner parties, and certainly we know New York City cops, from the cop on the beat to high department officials, patronized her shop and would have had the same deep discounts on this merchandise that anyone else had. So, it was a town where everybody was on the make, and certainly many of the police in that era were no exception. It's also vital to note that Fredricka Mandelbaum went into the underworld not because she was a bad person or because she wanted to pursue crime, but because she was disenfranchised 3 times over, not only from polite society, but from work in the legitimate world, the upper world. She was an immigrant, a woman, and a Jew. And God knows, we are living in this pervasive climate today of xenophobia and nativism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, and those forces are nothing new. They were very much present in her day. And although nobody yet had the brilliant idea to tax immigrants with the crime of eating their neighbors' household pets, they were certainly marginalized and terribly discriminated against in many other ways. And what's striking is the jobs available to immigrants then were terrible, dirty, dangerous, low paying. And so many instead, when they were shut out from being able to support their families in legitimate enterprise, they sought to climb what sociologists call the crooked ladder by making it in the underworld. What's so striking is there again, men had many more choices than women. A man in the underworld could run numbers, an illegal gambling joint, he could be hired muscle, he could help get out the vote for the Tammany Hall machine, bucket shops, a whole bunch of stuff. Women who, for whatever reason, sought a criminal livelihood had only 2 choices: shoplifting and, you know what's coming, prostitution. Shoplifting was so small time, it guaranteed that a woman and her family would remain in poverty. Prostitution guaranteed she would die young. There's a devastating statistic that I quote in the book from a study done in Fredricka's time in about the 1860s that 25% of the thousands of prostitutes in New York died each year, and a woman entering that life had an average life expectancy of just 4 years. So the choices for women were really terrible. So Fredricka, before climbing the crooked ladder as a woman, had to make her own ladder first.
Yeah, and I have to give her a round of applause for doing what she had to do, because these women didn't really have a choice. They either had to marry into money, go into prostitution, or like you said, peddle, or work in these factories making 2 cents a day or whatever it was. Yeah, it's just awful that women had to go through that. And I could see, if I were back then and seeing what this woman was doing, she would have been my idol and somebody I would aspire to be at that time. Because, you didn't see women up at the forefront being the innovators of industry during that time. We had, the Rockefellers and everything, the industrial age. Everything was attributed to men. at that time. And to see a woman, even though it's a criminal thing, I applaud her in her business like skills. I mean that if this could have been a legitimate business, I guarantee you her brand would probably still be around today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about how she finally got caught, or, pretty much her enterprise decided to falter and fall apart. We have Margalit Fox. She is the author of The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum. And we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Did you know that radio just got a little extraterrestrial? That's right, Dave Schrader is back on radio with the Paranormal 360 every Sunday evening, 7 to 9 p.m. Central on WCCO AM 830, an Odyssey station. Just download the Odyssey app and look for the WCCO logo, follow the station, and listen live. That's the Paranormal 360 on WCCO AM 830, an Odyssey station.
Oh, my little darklings, Theater of the Mind, Tales from the Darkness is out, and it's available right now. And I would love for you to pick up a copy of my brand new book. You can get it on Amazon wherever you live in this great, big, wonderful world of ours. Or if you'd like to get an autographed copy and you live here in the United States, go to paranormal60.com. We have the standard copy, non-autographed, just $20. Signed copy, only $30. And not only do we have this book, but we have my other book, The Other Side. And right now I'm running a special. If you pick up both books, you can get both books for $40, both signed. Both will be shipped in one package for one price. So go check out all the information at paranormal60.com. The Other Side, a teen's guide to ghost hunting and the paranormal, which is a guide on ghost hunting and the paranormal. Or you can get Theater of the Mind, Tales from the Darkness, real life encounters with the supernatural. And not only are they some of my all-time favorite stories from you, but there's a few of my favorite stories that have happened to me in the book as well. So go check it out, paranormal60.com, to order your copies, or you can buy copies wherever you are in the world that are unsigned at amazon.com. And I'll ask you this. Many of you have supported me in buying this book already. If you could just take 30 seconds to rate and review this book on Goodreads or on amazon.com, I would greatly appreciate it, because the more we get of good ratings and reviews, the more they expose this book to a wider, bigger audience. So I would appreciate that as a personal favor to me, your pal, Dave Schrader.
Hi, and we're back. I have Margalit Fox, who is the author of The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum. And before the break, we were going to kind of allude to what kind of made her empire fall apart. Like, what happened that caused everything to kind of fall through for Fredricka. So if you'd like to kind of allude to it, I know you don't want to give away too much because it's in the book and we want people to buy the book. And speaking of that, there is a link in today's description for the book, The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum. Okay, so she's getting to the point where she's at the peak of her career. So what kind of started making things unravel for her?
Well, Fredricka Mandelbaum had a successful career as a fence and criminal mastermind. I should point out that her business escalated from shoplifting to department store robberies to jewel robberies to bank burglaries. So she was really at the big time. She sustained her career for a quarter century, from about 1859 to 1884, practicing it more or less in the open. Pretty much everyone in town knew what she did. But then in the mid-1880s, American culture changed, and the culture of American cities changed, where before, cities like New York were run by these scrappy, up by their bootstraps immigrants, the kind of men, many of them Irish immigrants, who ran the Tammany Hall machine. Suddenly, there was a new generation of native-born, high-wasp, Ivy League educated patrician men who felt it was not only their duty, but their God-given, ennobled right to be in charge of American cities. And a lot of this had to do with the concerns of these bourgeois elite capitalists. They began to realize that operators like Mrs. Mandelbaum, and in fact, especially Mrs. Mandelbaum, were seriously undermining their profits in a range of industries, from jewelry to the textile industry. She stole a lot of silk and resold it, to banking. So in 1884, a reformist district attorney, a man named Peter Olney, who is one of these Harvard-educated, native-born patricians, comes into office, and he is pressured by his like-minded bourgeois elite, rich capitalists, to finally bring Fredricka Mandelbaum down. Well, he knows that a lot of the police are on her payroll. That's not going to be any good. So what does he do? He hires an outside firm, the Pinkerton Agency, who are by this time famous as capital's muscle, as one historian calls them. They are famous for breaking up strikes, often with fatalities, for many of the upper world robber barons of the day. So he, with the Pinkertons, sets up a sting operation where a Pinkerton operative goes undercover, becomes part of Mrs. Mandelbaum's organization, and eventually amasses enough evidence of illegal activity to bring her down. In 1884, Fredricka Mandelbaum is arrested. She is, for the first time, indicted on multiple counts of grand larceny, and she is scheduled to go to trial. At the last minute, aided by her deliciously corrupt law firm of Howe and Hummel, she pulls a caper worthy of a rogue of her stature, an 11th hour act of self-preservation that causes her, as if by magic, not to be in court when the bailiff calls her name to take the stand at the start of her trial. Long story short, she lives as a fugitive from the law for the last 10 years of her life.
How did she manage? Because she was so well known. How would she be able to flee and evade police for 10 years? I was talking to one of my other authors, and living on the run, I can't imagine that anxiety that would bring, just living on the run and knowing how prominent she was at that time in that area. Like you said, everybody knew her. What was her? Is there a way to kind of gauge what her mindset was like during those 10 years?
Well, she was very clever, and she knew she had to put down roots in a country that, at that time anyway, had no extradition treaty with the United States. And that's what she did. And before long, she was up to her old tricks, selling stolen goods over there.
Oh, is it a secret where it's at? Is that in the book? We want to hold that off? Is that a spoiler?
Yeah, it's in the book, and the book details exactly where she went, what she did, and what happened to her.
Oh, see, now that's why you guys got to buy this book. You need to know what happened to her. The Lost Years of Mrs. Mandelbaum. Because, yeah, I was going to say, wherever she fled to, did she start, turning those wheels again and start building another business the way she did in New York? Yeah, and setting down new roots. One thing I would like to, with this book that you've written, and obviously you've done extensive research, historical research, what are some of the lessons that modern day readers can take away from what she did back then?
Well, that the terrible forces that compelled many new arrivals in America to seek a criminal livelihood because they were shut out of everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Xenophobia, nativism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, those, as we know, have not gone away, and particularly since 2016, they have been shamefully, terrifyingly, dangerously alive well and out in the open in this country. So it's something to be very, very mindful of and to fight against with all our might, particularly with the election coming up in November. It's
Right.
painfully relevant to our own time.
Yeah, because when you look back at that, women were treated poorly, Jewish people were treated poorly, Irish were treated horribly too. I mean, and it was like there was really no reason for it, but that's just how it was. And trying to understand that the people back then, they went through it way worse because they didn't have the money, the resources, and the things that we have today. But it's awful to know that kind of mindset is still in the forefront, especially with this upcoming election. And it's sad to see that our country has not grown very far from 1850 New York. And so knowing, like, really getting an understanding of what these people were going through at the time, the immigrants that were coming over here. And I've watched many period pieces like that, and just to see the squalor and the way these people had to live and survive. I'm surprised that not everybody became a criminal at that time, because that was really the only way we were going to eat that night. And it's sad that she had to go through that, but she pioneered through it and grew something out of it.
That's right. And one of the things that stories like Mrs. Mandelbaum's allow us to see is they allow us to look at big social forces, crime, the underworld, the American economy, material culture, what was going on in cities, what was going on for immigrants. They allow us to look at those big forces at the level of the individual. One woman and her family. She went on to have 4 more children. She was widowed in the 1870s, but she was by then a rich woman. She could more than provide for her children and likewise provide for many of her immigrant neighbors who were far less well off than she. So it's very interesting for me, and I hope for readers, to see social history through the lens of the life of this one very unusual woman.
Right. It's kind of a great way to really look at the world through somebody's eyes like that, because, she had a lot to overcome to get where she was. I mean, just being a woman, Jewish back then, right there, people would have just shut the door on her. But she kept persevering. And, unfortunately, it was something illegal she did. But honestly, back then, the rich people, Rockefellers and everybody else, were doing the same dang thing. They just got away with it, so it was great fun. But thank you so much, Margalit, for this history lesson. I'm going to call this a history lesson because that's exactly what it is. Now, do you have a website or anything where people can go and check out some of your other books or any type of book signing events that you're going to?
I do. It's margalitfox.com. And I list my speaking engagements on my Facebook, which is just Facebook/Margalit Fox.
Yeah, and I'll have a link for that, your website, and the book link in today's program, guys. And I look forward to having you on again. I'm going to check out some of your other books. I got to have you on. You were awesome. And I thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope to see you all next week.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. And until our next case, my armchair detectives, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay aware. I'll see you right here next week on Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot.